and it is spring. I'm here in Atlanta and I can look out my window and see all of the blossoms. I'm loving this. We have a great show for you today. I have some amazing guests. Before I get to my guests, I'd love to tell you a little bit about me and the show. You are listening to Onward, and I am your host, Adrianne Hamilton Butler. Onward is about how we move on from those things that are unexpected, unwanted, and uncertain in our lives. And so it's an opportunity to just have conversations with everyday people who have taken things that have happened in their lives that some would see as negative and how they've turned them into positives. You are listening to Onward on WCEG Talk Radio. You can follow us on WCEGTalkradio.org. You can also listen to us on your YouTube channel, as well as Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram, as well as X. You can follow us on WCEG Talk Radio or WCEG. The content that you're listening today is that of the host and the guests and not of WCEG. So first, I want to welcome our guests. I want to say thank you to Lavon Morris Grant and Elle Cole. Thank you for joining me today. Lavon is an international keynote speaker, author, and domestic violence survivor who has used her platform to empower women and to share with them how they can overcome, especially for those who are domestic violence survivors. Lavon has been well known throughout the community for her work, especially among Black women and empowering Black women to be overcomers. Lavon, thank you for joining us today. And before I get on to you and your important work, I also want to share with you Elle Cole, who is joining me today. Elle is an award-winning writer and advocate for sickle cell disease and type 1 diabetes. Elle has become an advocate because of what has happened in her family regarding sickle cell disease. And we're going to talk with Elle at length about sickle cell disease, how it affects families, and her work to empower families to be health advocates for their children and themselves. But before we move on to Elle, I want to talk to Lavon. How's it going, Lavon?
It is going well, Adrianne. I am always excited to be in space with you, whether personal, or professional, or both. So I am doing well. Things are going well. I'm excited for what's coming. And so, yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Lavon, for being on. I know your work is phenomenal in the DV space, and you have helped so many personally and through your own organization. But today we're going to talk a little bit about a leadership training that you have coming up in May. Why don't you share a little bit about that and what was the foundation for you having this leadership conference?
Great. Thank you for the opportunity. Good morning, everyone. Here to you or coming to you here from Atlanta. And always glad to be here. I'm not a morning person, but I make it work. I make it work.
I love it. I love it. I thought about that when I invited you on. I said, I know Lavon is not a morning person, but
yes,
it's a great opportunity.
But we make ourselves do what we need to do.
Exactly. Exactly.
Anyway, good morning again. And so, Adrianne, like with all what you said, I appreciate it. And outside of all the work I've done, I've been an entrepreneur for almost 30 years. And with that, it has allowed me to travel the globe as an international speaker, as an author of 2 great books. And, not just share my story, but to share the disparities, to share the dynamics, not just of domestic violence, right? Even though that's what got me there, but about how we can get to healing from whatever it is we've dealt with. Domestic violence or social justice, the bigger part of that is the space I work out of, but it's not just focusing on one particular issue, it's focusing on a lot of issues: racism, homophobia, all those things impact the lives of women, particularly those being abused, right? And so, in all of that, as an entrepreneur, I, at this point in my life, I've created several programs that I will be hosting coming up in May 1st and May 2nd, called the Empower Her, the Black Women's Leadership Training. And Adrianne, to answer that question of how it came about because, again, in all my years of traveling, meeting so many wonderful people, and particularly Black women, and in our spaces of the nonprofit sector, even corporate America, right? People don't realize that only 19% of Black women are in CEO positions in the whole nonprofit sector, not just the social justice sector. And in corporate America, only 1.4% of Black women are in CEO positions. And so we have to figure out how to change that narrative because it's going to be up to us to change that narrative. And so with all of my travels and hearing from Black women, talking about how they would love the support from their organizations or their CEOs or whomever, the leadership, to help build their leadership and support their leadership, but from a diversity, from a racial equity lens of being a Black woman, because our leadership shows up different than the way other people's leadership may show up. Our leadership isn't or should not always be attached to the titles we hold. Because in the nonprofit sector, for sure, I know a lot of Black women are regulated or delegated to the administrative roles, and people don't see that as leadership, but it is, because before I come to your job, my everyday experiences tell me I'm a leader. But see, we don't look at it from that perspective. We attach it to a job and how many people we are supervising or not, right?
Right.
And so as I've gotten older, which I'm older, I was just thinking like, wow, what else can I do, right, with the platform and the influence I've been giving and I've been blessed with and the credibility that I have gained? And what can I do? Because Lavon Marv's grin is okay, right? I'm
Right.
okay. But it's not enough to just be okay because we don't live in a bubble. And
Right. And
so
go ahead, Lavon.
I was going to say, and so Adrianne, the Black Women's Leadership was training was born out of that. Like, what else can I bring that will benefit people directly, or women, right, directly in their lives? And so that's how the Black Women's Leadership Training came about.
And I love that, Lavon, because what you said is so powerful that for a lot of us, leadership shows up in our doing rather than our being. And who we are should be leveraged to lead, to give back, to mentor, to help build community. And so this is a great opportunity for us as African American women, Black women, to participate and to learn from each other about showing up, being our authentic selves, no matter what space we're in. So I appreciate you for that. Tell us when the training is going to take place and how people can sign up.
Great, great. Yes, the training will be virtual. So you could come from wherever you are in the comfort of your own home or even your car. If you can, get into the link from whatever apparatus you use. And so the training will be May 1st and May 2nd, 2024, from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. both days. And again, like I said, it'll be virtual, and we are hoping in the next months or so to have it live here in Atlanta. And so people can access the training. To sign up for the training, in particular for Women's Month, we have a discount rate for Women's Month, which the training is $250 for those 2 days. We have excellent keynote speakers coming and other speakers coming into the space to speak with the group. And the training, you can access the training at www.lavonmorrisgrant.com/training dash page. And I'm sure, Adrianne, we could try to get that in the chat, or I'll try to get it into
Yes,
the chat.
please
But
do.
yes,
Yes, and
yes,
it's
I will.
so it's
Yeah, I'll get it.
www.
Yes,
Okay, that is great
yes,
because we want to make sure that plenty of people sign up, especially now that you do have a discount during Women's History Month.
yes, yes, during Women's History Month. And the last thing I would say, Adrianne, and whatever other questions you may have, is I just wanted to tell them a quick bit about what they will get from the training. Um, that's the part that excites me because a lot of times in all my years of going to trainings or a conference, once you go, you no longer have access always to the people or to the presenters. And so I took all of what I knew and I made it a little different. And what I did was, after the training, the 2 days of training, you will be automatically, if you choose to, you can opt out, but you will automatically have access to the Black Women's Leadership Facebook community group
Oh,
that will
wonderful.
be created as. And so you are automatically entered into that. You have access to the people that you just left, and you have access to me because every once a month, maybe, I will drop in live and do some lives and or bring some guests into
Great.
the Facebook group. So you're learning and your networking don't stop after May 2nd. It will continue to grow. And as we have more Black women leadership trainings, that group will also be entered into the Facebook community group. So it's a
Love
safe
it.
space for Black women, and it's something that will be ongoing and it will be engaging and networking. And the last thing is, and my age is leaving my brain, but there is a last thing that you will get. You'll get some coaching. Oh, the other exciting thing about the training is a month after the training, so that would be in June, the whole group will come back together on Zoom and we will meet for about 90 minutes just to talk about your experiences
Love
with
it.
the training and what you've been doing in that 90 days and what
Great.
can we do to help support if that's something you are in need of, but just
Yeah.
to reconnect and once again build relationship with each other so that you don't feel like you're out here alone, or if you don't have anyone to talk to at your agency, you may be the only Black person in your leadership position. And so we're not going to just give this to you and then leave you out there. We will be here for the long haul to support this because we have to change those numbers. And I'm believing this is one of the ways to at least start and make a difference in other platforms of the work that we're doing.
I love this, Lavon. Thank you again for being on and for sharing with us this dynamic and impactful training that you're going to have May 1st through the 2nd. Just one more time before we end our conversation, please tell us how people can join you for this training in May.
Yes. Once again, it's www.lavonmorrisgrant.com/training dash page. www.lavonmorrisgrant.com// training dash page. Even sometimes I forget. And yes, and so you can go to that page and you can find out even more about the training. And please register for the training and don't miss out on your Women's History Month discount.
Thank you again, Lavon. It's been great seeing you, and let's catch up soon. Thank you
Yes,
for
thank
being
you.
on.
Yes, and
Bye.
thank you, Elle. Thank you for all the work you're doing. Bye bye, Adrianne.
Bye. So before we get with our guest, Elle Cole, just want to remind you that you are listening to Onward on WCEG talkradio.org. Thank you for following us. You are listening to WCEG, the Worldwide Community Empowerment Group. Elle, thank you for joining us this morning.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me.
So, Elle, you are an advocate, an author, a family empowerer all around sickle cell disease and type 1 diabetes. Tell us how you became an advocate for these diseases that impact significantly the African American community.
Absolutely. So I'm going to start with me being in college. I met my husband in college. I was 17 and he was 18. And we went to a college. We fell in love essentially. And while we were dating, he told me that he had type 1 diabetes. I wasn't really familiar with it. And, I just figured it was something he was managing. And we went on to get married. We dated for 5 years. I'm happy to share that last month in February, we celebrated our 18th wedding anniversary. So
Congratulations.
thank you so much. And, when we started to plan our family, we had been married for about 3 years, and we were at one of my doctor's appointments, and it was probably my 20th week appointment where the OBGYN said to us both that, we both had to be tested. And then she told both of us, she told me that I had sickle cell trait. I was a carrier. I had never heard about sickle cell trait prior to that experience. And then she told my husband that he was also a carrier of sickle cell trait. Now, what's interesting and why I want to pause here is because prior to that moment, neither my husband nor I had ever even been told that we were sickle cell trait carriers. And
Okay.
so we were, essentially walking kind of blindsided
Right.
about our carrier status. And so what she told us after telling us that we were both carriers, because at that moment we didn't know what it meant, she then told us that you have 1 in 4 chance of having a child with sickle cell disease. Now, I was carrying twins. And so she said, I don't know if one of your children will have sickle cell or both of them. We're really not sure when the egg split. So we won't find out if your children have sickle cell disease until after you give birth. Now, you can do an amniocentesis prior to that, but we chose not to. And so during that time, while I was pregnant, I began to research and I began to learn
Yes.
all I could about sickle cell disease. And then after I gave birth, I found out after the newborn screening. So now in the United States, since 2006, they have been doing what is called newborn screening. They do a Hill
Mm.
test where they check for genetic abnormalities. And they found out that one of my twins was in fact, she had sickle cell disease. Specifically, she had sickle cell type SS, which is what we call sickle cell anemia. Now, I want to pause here just for a
Yes.
second because sickle cell disease, you don't always hear people say sickle cell anemia anymore
Right.
because we now say sickle cell disease because there are many different types of sickle cell diseases. So my daughter has SS, but there can be SC, SD, SE, SO, sickle beta thalassemia, and more. There are hundreds of hemoglobinopathies. And in our community, SS is the most common. And so when you think about a genetic disorder that's most common in Black communities, you're generally talking about SS. The second most common type is SC. And so I wanted to just clarify that for people who are, curious, is it only a Black disease? No, because
Right.
now that we know there are so many different hemoglobinopathies,
Yes.
when they pair with a sickle trait, they all become sickle cell disease and they can have complications.
So,
So
Elle, I apologize. I wanted to ask you because you just touched on something that I think is so important as we're continuing the conversation, and that is sickle cell disease is not a Black disease.
correct.
Can you share with us other cultures, ethnicities, races that also have high levels of sickle cell disease?
So yes, so I will first start by saying that anywhere where malaria was common, the sickle cell trait developed. And so when you look at subtropic regions around the world, you will find people who are sickle cell trait carriers. And so it was a mutation that protected people against deadly malaria. So when you have sickle cell trait, it makes it harder for you to get malaria. So that is how it formed. But unfortunately, when two people have the trait, you can get sickle cell disease. And so that is one of the drawbacks about it. And so when we think about people around the world, there are over 200 million people around the world who have sickle cell disease. And so like people who are of Italian descent may have sickle cell disease. People from Saudi Arabia, really all over the world, not just here in America. Now, the largest populations are in Africa. So Nigeria has the largest population. And then India has a very large population. And what has been said is the second largest. Now, I want to just say that these statistics that we quote are approximations because our world does not have a good data collection system. One of the things that I fight for as an advocate is better data collection here in America and around the world so that we will know those exact numbers. But what we do know is that sickle cell disease is the most common genetic disorder in the world. And so yes. So it's really important that we have discussions like this because a lot of people don't realize it's so common because sometimes in our community, because it's a genetic disorder, it is, people are ashamed and they may not share that they have sickle cell disease or a loved one with it or that they are sickle cell trait carriers. Now, typically people who are sickle cell trait carriers, like myself, don't show symptoms. So most likely
Right.
they don't know that they have it.
That is correct because I too am carry the trait, and so to your point, I didn't know that either until I became pregnant, and my husband is not a carrier, so for us it was not an issue. But to your point, we often don't learn about this until the time that are with a child. Can you give me an approximate of the number of those carrying the trait in the United States?
Yes, 1 in 12 people carry the trait in the United States. 1 in
Wow.
12 African Americans. So not
Wow.
not people. So I want to just say like for Caucasians, it's 1 in 80,000 that may have sickle cell disease. So
Okay.
that number is really broad. It's
Right.
rare among Caucasian people, but the second largest population that has sickle cell disease are people of Hispanic descent. And so that's
Okay.
something that we don't always talk about. And
No,
so we are shedding light. My books are in English and Spanish for that reason,
that is
because it's very
wonderful.
important that we're inclusive about this
That's
because
correct.
yes. And I want to say that worldwide, there are over 300,000 infants that are born with sickle cell disease each year. So this conversation is very timely.
So, what I'd like to know, and I'm sure our listeners want to know, is in the United States, approximately how many infants are born with sickle cell disease? And also, a lot of people don't even know what happens with someone who has sickle cell disease. Can you talk a little bit about the disease itself?
So in the United States, about 1 in 365 children are born with sickle cell disease. Um, in the African American
Okay.
community. But again, we have to do a better job of that data collection. We are getting those numbers from the newborn screening, which we now do. So it's important. When it comes to sickle cell disease, a lot of people have heard that sickle cell disease causes pain. So let me just describe what sickle cell disease is.
Yes.
It is a genetic disorder that changes the shape of a person's red blood cells. Now, that
Yeah,
sounds so simple and like it's not a big deal, but it is.
it
So,
is.
a normal red blood cell is circular. like a donut, is round. It can travel through our blood vessels very easily. But a sickled red blood cell, so it's kind of the shape of a C, it's, really an odd shape. And what can happen is they can get hard, rigid, and sticky and start to stick together, and they don't travel through the body easily. And your red blood cells carry oxygen throughout your entire body. And just like we need oxygen to breathe, our body needs oxygen to stay healthy. And so one of the problems and complications that can occur with sickle cell disease is different organs can be deprived of the oxygen it needs to stay alive. So another complication is bone death, bone damage from the bones not getting the oxygen it needs. So people with sickle cell disease are at risk of having what is called a vascular necrosis. And it's shortened to the abbreviation AVN. They can have stroke. So the statistics say 20 to 30% of children with sickle cell disease experience stroke. And so when we think about stroke in our community, we think about it being older people, sometimes people with an unhealthy diet, but children with sickle cell disease, because that deprivation of oxygen, are at risk of stroke.
Okay.
And so once a year, children who are pediatric patients up until the age of 16 are tested through what is called a transcranial Doppler test, which is an ultrasound like a mom would get for her baby. They get an ultrasound, but they get it on their brain so that the doctor can hear how the blood is flowing in the brain. And that tells the doctor if a pediatric patient is at risk of having a stroke. So it's a stroke screen test. And it's very important that that is done once a year. It's also important to note that people with sickle cell disease can have problems from head to toe. So it can cause hearing impairment, it can cause vision impairment. So retinopathy is another problem. And these two problems are things that you don't often hear about. But again, wherever blood flows, there can be complications. So people with sickle cell disease often have to have more specialists than just a hematologist, just a blood doctor, because so many other problems. There can be problems with their heart, just really a litany of other problems. And so it is a health concern because sickle cell, just in the state of Maryland, I am in Maryland, and just in the state of Maryland, over 4,000 hospitalizations it's costing the state about $59 million. So in our community, this is something that we really need to get a pulse on and talk to our community about, because it's costing families. Just having a loved one with sickle cell disease, and someone like me who has private insurance, we pay a lot in copays out of pocket. And so we have to have better healthcare treatments, and you really want to have the best because you want to have specialists that know about sickle cell. And unfortunately, there are people who are practicing medicine and they're not very familiar with sickle cell disease.
So, Elle, when you found out that one of your children had sickle cell, you said you immediately went into research mode. Part of it was, of course, wanting the knowledge, but part of it was, as a mom, you were concerned and worried about how this would impact your child. So tell us a little bit about that feeling of going into this situation now, knowing that your child has sickle cell disease, and how that moved you towards being really an advocate, not just for your family, but for other families.
Absolutely. When I got the notice in the mail, it was 3 months after I had given birth, and I received a letter from the health department. And the letter said that your child has sickle cell hemoglobin type SS, and you need to find your child a hematologist. And I am not in the medical field. And I said, okay, how do I go about finding a hematologist? I had just become a new mother, so it was a lot to carry. I was married, but my husband really didn't understand this whole genetic disorder. And he wasn't really in tune at the time. And so it was really something that I carried alone because although I am a sickle cell trait carrier, I don't know of anyone else in my family who has sickle cell
Mm,
disease, and neither does my
right.
husband. So it was something that we carried alone. And I knew that it was a heavy weight to carry by myself. I am an educator. And I said, well, what do I do when I want to reduce my fears? I
Yeah.
educate myself. I
Yes.
find out the information. And I had two beautiful babies. I don't just
Yes.
have one. I was a mother of twins, so I had to really be attentive to both of my children. And
Yes.
being a new mother in and of itself is a lot. And
Yes.
being a mother of twins, of multiples, was a lot. And I didn't have family in my area. And so I said, how do I get ahead of this before it gets ahead
Yeah.
of me? And I said, I have to meet people who are living with this and living well. So social media for me was a saving grace. I started to join different Facebook groups with different people who have sickle cell disease. And
Okay.
I started a blog. My husband, for my first Mother's Day, he gave me a new computer and told me to write about my experiences. My friends from college and high school, they weren't married yet. They were still in
Okay.
graduate school getting their doctorate and different things. So I was a new mom, and my friends weren't sharing that experience with me. So I had to find other people because, you're sharing all the milestones and your friends are
Yes.
like, okay, they're tired of hearing all your baby stories. And so not only did I have my baby stories, but I was really trying to understand this health thing. And
Right.
so I just immersed myself in the community, sharing my story and becoming an expert of my story. But also, I wanted my daughters to grow up without fear, but also receiving
Right.
a lot of love without being sheltered. So I
Yes.
asked other sickle cell people living with sickle cell, I said, what is it that I should know as a parent? And they told me, don't shelter your child. Let her live.
Mm,
Let her live. Now,
mm.
I'll say that for the
Yeah.
first 7 years of her life, I homeschooled her, not to shelter her, but I wanted to make sure that she wasn't exposed to a whole lot of germs. I wanted to make sure that she had a better immune system before
Right.
I put her in a traditional school. Now my daughters are 15 years old and they are in high school, and my daughter is
Awesome.
living well. When she was 6, she was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes.
Okay.
And so I said, look, sickle cell disease is enough for one
Right.
person. But when you put type 1
Now,
diabetes on top of that, I
exactly.
said, this is very difficult. And I said, this challenge, I don't know, we call ourselves as Black women, strong women, but
Yes.
I said, this may be too much for me. And in that moment, I looked at my children and they were just so full of life, so intelligent.
Yes.
And I said, sometimes things happen for a reason, and it's
Yes.
not just about you and your family. It is
Right.
sometimes because you will speak up, you will speak out, and you will help other people. You will be a voice for others. And so to me, that was the message that I received about these two illnesses and how it relates to my family. I said, there has been a calling on my life to speak
Yes.
up and to speak out. And I have to educate my people in a way that uplifts them, that provides hope, and that makes sure that changes take place. So on December 8th, we made history. December 8th, 2023, the FDA approved the first two curative therapies, gene therapies,
Oh,
here
that's
in the
great.
United States to that potentially are cures for people with sickle cell disease. Now, we don't really use the terminology cure because once that damage from sickle cell disease is done, so I mentioned like AVN, I mentioned complications from stroke, it doesn't reverse those complications, but it can stop crisis and things in the future. And so what we call those in our community is transformative therapies because it transforms the person's life and how the disease exists. So
That is wonderful. And you know, I love what you're saying about the fact that once you realized that this was happening to your family, you realized that it was bigger, and that you felt a calling to then help other families. And really the theme of this show is a brave new world. And what we mean by that is sometimes when things happen to us, and you talked about the pressures of being a mom of twins, of having a child with sickle cell disease, we turn inward and we don't share, or we feel a lot of pressure. But you did not do that. You did not turn inward. You went outward, and you created an opportunity for yourself and your family to help change the lives of others. So now I want to shift to the advocacy work that you're doing, the empowerment that you're doing with other families, not just about sickle cell disease and those who have it, but for the caregivers as well. And also, I want to talk a little bit about your award winning books that you have written. And I love that they're bilingual, by the way. But the books that you have written to help educate families.
So I'm going to start with one of the projects that I do that's near and dear to my heart. Each November, November is National Family Caregiver Month, and each November I co-host a summit for caregivers. And the summit is in partnership with the Sickle Cell Community Consortium, and we educate families for 3 days about sickle cell disease, but we
Wow.
also provide a community of support because nobody really understands this experience
Right.
like other caregivers. And so we provide a community. And last November, we had over 440
Oh,
people from around the world who attended the conference. And we give them care packages. And we really have an opportunity to love on families who are
yes.
impacted by sickle cell disease. So that is one of the things that I do in my community that really means a lot to me. And I
Yes.
feel obligated because my daughter is doing well. And I know that it is a very unique experience. She has some of the best doctors. And so, because I am not personally in the hospital all the time with my daughter, this is a way for me to give back because I have that time that I can give to my community. Whereas other caregivers, they have the desire to do it, but because their loved one is in and out the hospital continuously, they simply don't have the time. And so that is one of the things that I do. And you mentioned my books. There's a lot of other things I do, but when it comes to my books, this is one. This was the very first book that I published. It has a companion that's a coloring book. So these
Oh,
two
great.
books are two books that I wrote after my daughter had her very first crisis. And I
Okay.
mentioned that one of the ways that I live my life is to educate in order to lessen fears. And when my
Yeah.
daughter had that first crisis, I had to explain to her what was happening to her body, but also to her twin sister, because she was concerned about what was happening. My children were 5 at the time when my daughter had her first crisis. And as an educator, I knew that my children learn from books. And
Mm.
so I wrote books with characters that I had illustrated, especially for them, with children
Oh,
that
that's
look like
great.
them, that provided
Yes.
representation, but also the doctors and the healthcare workers in the books also reflect their doctors and families and the diversity within this space. They
Yes.
needed to see themselves not just as patients, but
Right.
also as healthcare providers.
Yes, that
And
is
so it was
great.
very intentional how I wrote my books. And most recently, my daughter, she partnered with me to write a book about type 1 diabetes. Now, type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease. Sickle cell is a genetic disorder. And my husband, I mentioned, has type 1 diabetes, and I didn't
Yeah.
know there was a genetic component to it. But autoimmune diseases can have a genetic component. And
Yes.
so that is one of the reasons why my daughter, it happens to be the same daughter who has sickle cell disease. She
Mm.
also has type 1 diabetes. And
Okay.
so I knew that there were no books that reflected Black children. And they
Right.
didn't have that representation. And so we needed to be able to tell a story. What coloring does, it helps to reduce stress.
Yes.
And this was a simple way for us to be able to provide education, because with type 1 diabetes, there's a lot of education that you have to do in order to care for yourself properly. And we can't wait till a child is in high school or a teenager to be able to
Right.
care for themselves. They have to start
Exactly.
at a very young age. And so that's why I write the books that I do. And so another book that I write, and this is about sickle cell disease. It's an activity book. And
Oh,
one of the
great.
reasons why I wrote this particular book was because I wanted to make sure that we could have fun while learning, but we needed
Yes.
to know about the body from sickle cell trait, the foundation, all the way through the different complications and how sickle cell disease is progressive. So this book is really for anybody that is
Right.
trying to learn about sickle cell disease. And it starts with debunking a lot of those myths
Yes.
around sickle cell disease. And it starts with sickle cell trait. What is true about sickle cell trait? And it starts with a timeline. How has the American timeline in the African American pioneers who made sure that research was being done and federal
Yes.
dollars were being allocated to our community. We still have a long way to go,
Yes.
because when you talk about sickle cell and our healthcare system, there's still a lot of racism that exists in medicine. And so this is a way for our youth to learn the history. And I feel like when we learn the history around things, we can make better informed decisions about our future. And
I
so I
agree.
took my education background and I put it into my books to teach the next generation.
So, Elle, you mentioned this wonderful conference that you have in November geared towards the caregivers. And I want to spend some time on the caregiving aspect because a lot of times the caregivers are forgotten. And it takes a lot for our families because while their children or other family members are going through this, people are still working, they're still having their own crises. Tell us about how you work with caregivers and what this conference really means to those who are spending their time taking care of others.
So, caregivers, it's not just the parents who give birth to the children. In our conference, caregivers are siblings, they're
Yes.
spouses, they are friends.
Yeah.
Really, caregiver can be anyone who's really taking on that role to
Yeah.
care for a loved one with sickle
Yes.
cell disease. And so within the conference, we have like that first day, we really dedicate to healthcare professionals that are teaching about the cutting edge treatments that are available. What's new. We also talk about the ED experience, which is the emergency department experience, because a lot of problems happen in the emergency room where sometimes patients are turned away, sometimes patients are
Mm.
not admitted in a timely manner. And the thing about sickle cell disease, it's so unpredictable. The
Okay.
sickling can occur rapidly, and a person can be in a really difficult position and sometimes lose their life very quickly,
Mm.
especially in that emergency room department. So
Okay.
we talked about like the pain crisis, which is the hallmark of the disease, which is
Okay.
excruciating pain. Some patients with sickle cell disease have described it as little shards of glass going
Mm.
through their blood vessels.
Okay.
And so that pain is very unbearable.
Yes.
Right now, there is actually no treatment for sickle cell pain.
Oh.
So the treatments that exist are treatments that increase the fetal hemoglobin. That is the hemoglobin that we have when infants are born. When infants are born, they have hemoglobin, what is called fetal hemoglobin, which is their mom's hemoglobin.
Yes.
And generally stops around 4 to 6 months. And so what happens is when that stops, when they lose their fetal hemoglobin, they have their own adult hemoglobin, and the protein, that hemoglobin that's in the red, that's misshapen in the red sickled cells, that's what's causing the problem. But if that's what doctors have found, if that fetal hemoglobin is turned back on, maybe they would have less complications.
Okay.
And so the treatments that exist are around increasing fetal hemoglobin, but not treating sickle pain. And
The
so
pain, right.
So people with sickle cell disease, they generally take opioids for the pain. And so what we as advocates in the sickle cell space are fighting for is more treatment options so that there is a medicine for pain, because people with sickle cell disease sometimes are considered drug seekers because they need that pain medicine to survive, because pain can kill you.
Right.
And so we are looking for a revolution in the medical system so that our sickle cell patients, and I don't like to say patients because in our community, we call people living with sickle cell disease sickle cell warriors, because it is a lifelong condition and they are warriors. They are fighting through this. Unfortunately, they have to fight the disease, fight the
Okay. Elle? Okay, so we are having a conversation with Elle Cole, who is talking to us about sickle cell disease and the impact on families. I don't know if the issue is on my end or on Elle's end, but want to give it a few minutes to see if we can correct this. In the meantime, you are listening to Onward on WCEG talkradio.org. Okay. Well, hey there, everybody. So it looks like I have dropped off, and I'm trying to figure out if it is me or if it is station. Okay, I'm going to leave and come back. Okay, great. I haven't dropped off. All right. So thank you, everybody, for listening. Again, it is Onward on WCEG Talk Radio. We have been listening to Lavon Morris Grant, who is telling us about her upcoming Empower Her Leadership Conference in May. And you can register for Lavon's event at lavonmorris.com. And you can go to her training page to learn more about that. We've also been listening to Elle Cole, who has been telling us about caregiving and what it's like to be the parent of a child who has sickle cell disease. She was sharing that sickle cell disease impacts 1 out of 365 African American children born in the United States. That is a sobering statistic. And even more sobering is the fact that many of us, as African American parents, do not realize that many of us are carrying the trait that we may pass on to our children. And if we marry someone with the trait, that child has a 1 in 4 chance of developing sickle cell disease. And so Elle has been sharing with us what she has been doing in this space. I believe she is back on because we really want to hear more about what we can do to learn and to advocate for ourselves, especially for our families that have that are impacted by sickle cell disease. So I think we have Elle back on. Hi, Elle.
Hi.
Hey there. So welcome back. So we have a few minutes left in the show, and what I'd really love to do is have you cover a couple of things, and that is self-care for caregivers, especially in our community, because you referenced the fact that as African American women, we bring a strong front to any situation that comes our way. But really, how do we take care of ourselves when we're faced with any situation where there is struggle and pain involved, especially for our children, the ones that we love so much? And then the other thing I'd love for you to do is to talk about how you encourage both your daughters, how you keep them thriving and living a life where they can see impact, even though one of your daughters is living with pain.
Thank you so much. So, self-care is very important to me because you cannot care for others if you are not taking care of yourself. And that includes going to your own doctor's appointments. It includes just taking time out to breathe. And what I discovered very early in my caregiver journey was that I had to learn what practicing self-care was for me,
Yes.
because self-care doesn't look the same for everybody. And I feel like it's one of those buzzwords that we often use, and we talk about manis and petties, but that may not be, for every woman. She may not
Right.
be a mani and petty type of person. So
Right.
what does that mean? And I think is doing self-work. One of the
Mhm.
books that I've written is 90 Days for Me, a self-love guided journal for parents. And I
Love
wrote
that.
it as a letter to myself because I
Yes.
need to spend as little as 5 minutes a day just assessing my own needs. So this book is broken into 3 different sections. So every 30 days, you do a self-assessment, very quick, because I know we as parents, as caregivers, no matter what, as regardless of the role that you have as, women who work, we don't have a lot of time. And
Right.
so it helps us think about our legacy that we want for ourselves. How do we want to be remembered? How do we
Yes.
want to show up? How do we want our kids to remember us? And for me, I started to, write in my journal. Writing for me is a cathartic experience where I'm
Yeah.
able to put down my thoughts, my joys, my fears, and just anything that's on my mind. As a visionary, I'm always working, but in order to be healthy, I have to turn that off. And I do that by writing it down, putting it in a book so that I can pick it up later and then
Yes.
think, this is something I can tackle now, this would be tackled later, but it helps me provide structure to my life, which otherwise probably would be kind of chaotic. And another thing that I personally do to practice self-care is to have quiet time. So I try to get up a little bit earlier, um,
Yes.
before other people in my house, so that I can just have time to, maybe listen to an audiobook, maybe, read or pray, just regardless of what it is, I need some personal time to do things by myself. And
Yes.
I'm technically an introvert. So I know that may be hard to believe for some, but I need that alone time to just
Yes.
make sure that I'm okay. And I do that in the morning hours. So I try to exercise. I have one of those desk treadmills where, I'm able to multitask but exercise. And I like to put on music and dance. So there are a variety of things that I do in order to practice self-care and what it means to me. So cooking and baking, I like to make our food and not order out. So that is a form of
Yes.
self-care because I'm doing it by myself, but I'm doing it in a way that is feeding my soul, not
Right.
just physically, but it's keeping me busy, it's keeping me
Yes.
positive. And that's what I do to practice self-care. Sometimes that could be going to a movie by yourself, or for me, I like to watch shows, by myself sometimes.
Yes.
And so I think you just have to kind of find your thing. It could be painting, writing, it could be poetry slams. Like, really, there's no right or wrong way to practice self-care. And so for my daughters, I also wanted them to see me practicing self-care and
Yes.
also doing the things that I love. So they see me writing my books, they see me, traveling and speaking all over the country. And they are able to see that mom doesn't just turn on, her advocacy. Mom also lives a life of, you know, intention. So
Yeah.
I'm very intentional about having time, spending time with myself, but also making time for my husband and making time for my kids. Because when you have a lot on your plate, it is hard. I don't think balance really exists. You have to find ways to cope and to really normalize what's normal for you.
That's right. And being intentional, I like that you used that word. And so for your daughters, you said part of them seeing you take care of yourself is that I think it helps them to be calm because they know that mom really is just being her authentic self and it's okay. And so for your daughters, what are the things that you advise them to do to be able to move forward and to live their authentic selves despite one having sickle cell disease and one being in the presence of one that she loves having sickle cell disease?
My daughters are artists. And for them, they paint or draw to practice self-care. And so one is really into digital art. The other, she does painting and also different collages. They do different art forms. My husband is also an artist. And so that is how they practice self-care. That's also, it brings them joy. So my daughter with sickle cell, she likes to crochet. She likes to make things. She's a creative. Her sister she loves to read. So she reads tons of books, and then she recommends books for me to read. I really look
Love
to her
it.
for guidance.
I love it.
In that regard. And so it's really learning yourself. And I've
Yes.
taught my kids that, you can have your own things. So my kids have their own hobbies, their parents have their own hobbies. And we just came back from Zion National Park in Utah because
Yes.
one of our
Awesome.
collective hobbies as a family is hiking and
Love
visiting the
it.
national parks.
Yes.
So I want to show my children the world. I want them to live life without limits and be
Yes.
able to take collective risk. And so I have to model that for them. And
Yes.
I have to give them a safe space to do that while they're young so that when they're older, they can take up that mantle and do it on their own. So that's how I parent them and give them the confidence to show up as their authentic selves in the world.
I love this, Elle. And, as you and I talked yesterday, this time has flown by. I just want to quickly share that you have a website, I believe, Cleverly Changing. Can you share that with the audience? Because you're doing so much, and I want folks to know more about your advocacy and all that you're doing around sickle cell disease and caregiving.
Yes, my website, I have two. One is cleverlychanging.com. The other is sicklecellbooks.com. I'm also on social media. You can find me on LinkedIn at Elle Cole. You can also find me on Instagram at Cleverly Changing. I'm on Facebook at Cleverly Changing. And on Twitter, I'm on Twitter, which is called X now, as Cleverly Changing. So CleverlyChangin on Twitter. So on Twitter, it doesn't have the G on the N, but in every
Okay.
other place it does. So definitely
Okay.
connect and visit my website. You can see all of my books on cleverlychanging.com/shop.
Thank you so much, Elle, for your time. Well wishes to you and your family. We are done with Onward. Have a great Saturday, everyone. And as usual, gotta run.